Hello, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Welcome and thank you for participating in today's technical briefing, which will provide an update on the COVID-19 vaccines approval. Today, we'll hear from Dr. Supriya Sharma and Marc Berthiaume from Health Canada. Aujourd'hui, nous entendons des allocutions de Dr.
Today, we'll hear a speech from Dr. Supriya Sharma, and this presentation will be followed by questions and answers.
Procédons à la séance d'information technique. Let's begin today's technical briefing. Over to you, Dr. Sharma.
Bonjour, good day. Thank you for joining us today. I'm here to talk to you about Health Canada's authorization of the COVID-19 vaccine, which was developed by Janssen Inc. This is the fifth vaccine that Health Canada has authorized for the prevention of COVID-19. In fact, Canada is the first major regulator to have authorized 4 vaccines: Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, AstraZeneca Serum Institute of India, and Janssen. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the Janssen vaccine just a week ago, and it's currently under review by other major regulators. During this technical briefing, I'm going to provide you with some details about the Janssen vaccine, outline Health Canada's authorization process, explain the efficacy data behind the Janssen vaccine, and address differences in the various vaccines authorized by Health Canada. Single-dose COVID-19 vaccine to be authorized in Canada. The other 4 require 2 doses. It can be stored and transported at refrigerated temperatures between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius for at least 3 months, giving greater flexibility in how it can be distributed across Canada. The Janssen vaccine is an adenovirus vector-based COVID-19 vaccine, like the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Serum Institute of India's version of that vaccine that we authorized last week. Viral vector technology has been used by scientists since the 1970s for both vaccines and treatments, such as gene therapy to treat cancer. The Janssen vaccine is indicated for adults 18 years of age and older. Almost 20% of the participants in the clinical trials were 65 years of age and older, and no differences in safety or efficacy were seen compared to the younger groups. Ongoing studies are expected to provide more data about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine in other populations, such as children. A clinical trial in children aged 12 to 17 has been authorized by Health Canada, and this will be important research to support vaccine availability for Canadians of all ages. As with other vaccines, common side effects include pain and tenderness at the injection site, headache, muscle pain, fever, and chills. The majority of adverse reactions in clinical trials were mild to moderate in severity and resolved within a few days. As with all COVID-19 vaccines, Health Canada authorized the Janssen one after an independent and thorough scientific review for safety, efficacy, and quality. And assessing all the data, we concluded that there was strong evidence that showed that the benefits of this vaccine outweigh the potential risks. We approved this vaccine through an interim order pathway that allows us to accelerate the overall review process, and it was used for the approval of the other 4 COVID-19 vaccines as well. This pathway allows Health Canada to assess information submitted by the manufacturer as it becomes available during the product development process. Although this process was completed in a shorter time frame, Health Canada's rigorous review standards were upheld. Detailed information on Health Canada's review of this vaccine and all COVID-19 vaccines is available on the COVID-19 Vaccines and Treatment portal at covid-vaccine.canada.ca. As for the efficacy of the Janssen COVID-19 vaccine, in clinical trials, it was shown to be 66% effective overall in preventing moderate to severe COVID-19. This exceeds the efficacy standards issued by Health Canada, the World Health Organization, and other major regulators such as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So what does this level of protection actually mean? Looking at the results of a trial of over 40,000 people, in which half of the people received the vaccine and half did not receive the vaccine, in that study, a total of 464 people developed moderate to severe illness. Of those who developed COVID-19, 348 had received the no vaccine, while 116 had received the vaccine. Sadly, there were 5 deaths due to COVID-19 in the study. All of those were in the group that did not receive the vaccine. The Janssen trials showed that the vaccine provided consistent protection across all race and age groups, including adults over 60 years of age. Studies assessed the efficacy of the vaccine against the South African and the Brazilian variants, as well as the predominant strains circulating in the United States, which is also currently the predominant strain in Canada. While some minor differences were identified, the Janssen vaccine provided acceptable levels of efficacy in all regions against all variants tested. Health Canada is working with all manufacturers of authorized COVID-19 vaccines, as well as the manufacturers of the vaccines under review, to assess the efficacy of the vaccine against variants. While reductions in efficacy for particular variants is concerning, the impact of this reduction will really depend on the variants that are in circulation at the time. Now that we have authorized 5 vaccines, we need to talk about what the numbers mean and what's important for you to know. The efficacy rate does not mean that following vaccination with a vaccine with 66% efficacy, that you will have a 34% chance of contracting COVID-19. If you get vaccinated by any of the 5 vaccines, your chance of getting COVID-19 is greatly reduced. And while each has different efficacy numbers, the reality is that you will have a greatly reduced chance of getting COVID-19 with any of the 5 vaccines that have been authorized. But it's not just about getting COVID-19. What's really important is whether any of the vaccines will prevent you from being hospitalized or dying of COVID-19. We know that all of the vaccines will protect you. Of the 5 vaccines that Health Canada has authorized, not one person who was vaccinated as part of the various trials died of COVID-19, and all vaccines are effective against severe cases and hospitalization. That's a real success. Each vaccine has unique characteristics, and Health Canada's review has confirmed that the benefits of all these vaccines outweigh their potential risks. We've negotiated a broad and diverse COVID-19 vaccine portfolio to ensure we have sufficient supply for everyone in Canada, while also mitigating risks of supply disruptions and potential vaccine candidate setbacks or failures. Having additional vaccines from different manufacturers can help to meet volume requirements to get more people vaccinated sooner, and also affords more vaccination options. Our advice to Canadians is to get whichever vaccine is available to you. It's that simple. The longer you wait to get vaccinated, the longer the time goes by that you are not protected. At this time, we consider all the available vaccines to be effective, and ultimately the benefits, as we've said, with any of the authorized vaccines outweigh those potential risks. With 5 now authorized, Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada are actively monitoring the safety of vaccines in the real world. We monitored for any side effects in collaboration with the provinces and territories, international partners, and the manufacturers. As with all vaccines, we will take action if any safety issues are identified. So just to summarize, I want to take a minute to reflect on the incredible progress that has been made in 1 year's time and the tremendous effort and resources that have gone into the development of these vaccines. It is a scientific feat like no other, and the government has been delivering on its commitment to provide Canadians with access to safe, effective, and high-quality vaccines that will help us in our fight against this global pandemic. While the 5th vaccine authorization offers even more hope to an end to the pandemic, there are still challenges ahead. We all must do our best to continue following public health guidelines. That means we all need to keep working together by wearing a mask, washing our hands, and keeping our physical distance. Thank you very much.
Bonjour.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. Today, I'm here to talk to you about Health Canada's authorization of the COVID-19 vaccine, which was developed by Janssen Incorporated. This is the 5th vaccine that Health Canada has authorized for the prevention of COVID-19. Canada is the first major regulator to have authorized 4 vaccines: Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Serum Institute of India, and Janssen. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the Janssen vaccine just a week ago and is currently under review by other major regulators. During this technical briefing, I'm going to provide you with some details about the Janssen vaccine. I will outline Health Canada's authorization process, and I will explain the efficacy data behind the Janssen vaccine and address differences in the various vaccines authorized by Health Canada. The Janssen vaccine is the first single-dose COVID-19 vaccine to be authorized in Canada. The other 4 require 2 doses. Furthermore, it can be stored and transported at refrigerated temperatures between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius for at least 3 months, giving greater flexibility in how they can be distributed across Canada. The Janssen vaccine is an adenovirus vector-based COVID-19 vaccine like the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Serum Institute of India's version of that vaccine that we authorized last week. Viral vector technology has been used by scientists since the 1970s for both vaccines and treatments, such as gene therapy, to treat cancer. The Janssen vaccine is indicated for adults 18 years of age and older. Almost 20% of the participants in the clinical trials were 65 years of age or older, and no differences in safety or efficacy were seen compared to the younger groups. Ongoing studies are expected to provide more data about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine in other populations, such as children. A clinical trial in children aged 12 to 17 has been authorized by Health Canada, and this will be important research to support vaccine availability for Canadians of all ages. As with other vaccines, common side effects include pain and tenderness at the injection site, headache, muscle pain, fever, and chills. The majority of adverse reactions in clinical trials were mild to moderate in severity and resolved within a few days. As with all COVID-19 vaccines, Health Canada authorized the vaccine after an independent and thorough scientific review for safety, efficacy, and quality. After assessing all the data, we concluded that there was strong evidence that showed that the benefits of this vaccine outweigh the potential risks. We approved this vaccine through the interim order pathway that allows us to accelerate the overall review process, and it was used for the approval of the other 4 COVID-19 vaccines as well. This pathway allows Health Canada to assess information submitted by the manufacturer as it becomes available during the product development process. Although this process was completed in a shorter time frame, Health Canada's rigorous review standards were upheld. Detailed information on Health Canada's review of this vaccine and all COVID-19 vaccines is available on the COVID-19 Vaccines and Treatment Portal, covid-vaccine.canada.ca. As for the efficacy of the Janssen COVID-19 vaccine, in clinical trials, the vaccine was shown to be 66% effective overall in preventing moderate to severe COVID-19. This exceeds the efficacy standards issued by Health Canada, the World Health Organization, and other major regulators like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So, what does this level of protection actually mean? Looking at the results of a trial of almost 40,000 people in which half of the people received the vaccine and half did not, in that study, a total of 464 people developed moderate to severe illness. Of those who developed COVID-19, 348 had received the placebo, while 116 had received the vaccine. Sadly, there were 5 deaths due to COVID-19 in the study. All of those were in the group that did not receive the vaccine. The Janssen trial showed that the vaccine provided consistent protection across all race and age groups, including adults over 60 years of age. Studies assessed the efficacy of the vaccine against the South African and Brazilian variants, as well as the predominant strain circulating in the United States, which is also currently the predominant strain in Canada. While some minor differences were identified, the Janssen vaccine provided acceptable levels of efficacy in all regions against all variants tested. Health Canada is working with all manufacturers of authorized COVID-19 vaccines, as well as the manufacturers of the vaccines under review, to assess the efficacy of the vaccines against variants of concerns. While reductions in efficacy for particular variants is concerning, the impact of this reduction will really depend on the variants that are in circulation. Now that we've authorized 5 vaccines, we need to talk about what the numbers mean and what's important for you to know. The efficacy rate does not mean that following vaccination with a vaccine with 66% efficacy that you will have a 34% chance of contracting COVID-19. If you get vaccinated by any of the 5 vaccines, your chance of getting COVID-19 is greatly reduced. And while each of the vaccines that Health Canada has authorized has different efficacy numbers, the reality is that you will have a greatly reduced chance of getting COVID-19 with any of the 5 vaccines that have been authorized. But it's not just about getting COVID-19. What's really important is whether any of the vaccines will prevent you from becoming hospitalized or of dying of the disease. We know that all of the vaccines will protect you. Of the 5 vaccines that Health Canada has authorized, not one person who was vaccinated as part of the various trials died of COVID-19. And all vaccines are effective against severe cases and hospitalization. That is a real success. Each vaccine has unique characteristics, and Health Canada's review has confirmed that the benefits of all these vaccines outweigh their risks. Canada has negotiated a broad and diverse COVID-19 vaccine portfolio to ensure we have sufficient supply for everyone in Canada, while also mitigating risks of supply disruptions and potential vaccine candidate setbacks, or failures. Having additional vaccines from different manufacturers can help to meet the volume requirements to get more people vaccinated sooner and also offers more vaccination options. Our advice to Canadians is to get whichever vaccine is available to you. It's that simple. The longer you wait to get vaccinated, the longer the time goes by that you are not protected. At this time, we consider all the available vaccines to be effective, and ultimately, the benefits of vaccination with any of the authorized vaccines outweigh the risks of no vaccination. With 5 vaccines now authorized, Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada are actively monitoring their safety in the real world. We monitor for any side effects in collaboration with the provinces and territories, international partners, and the manufacturer. As with all vaccines, we will take action if any safety issues are identified. Just to summarize, I want to take a minute to reflect on the incredible progress that has been made in 1 year's time and the tremendous effort and resources that have gone into the development of these vaccines. This is a scientific feat like no other, and the government has been delivering on its commitment to provide Canadians with access to safe, effective, and high-quality vaccines that will help us in our fight against this global pandemic. While the 5th vaccine authorization offers even more hope to an end to the pandemic, there are still challenges ahead. We must all do our best to continue following public health guidelines. That means we need to continue to work together, wear a mask, wash our hands, and keep our social distance. Thank you.
Thank you, doctors. The doctors will now be ready to take your questions. We'll open the line to questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions dans l'une des 2 langues officielles. We ask that you limit yourself to 1 question and only 1 follow-up. For those asking questions in the room, we ask that you make your way to the freestanding mic. Operator, over to you for the first 3 questions.
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. Our first question, la première question, Marie-Vestel Le Devoir.
Marie-Vestel Le Devoir, you have the floor. Yes, I'd like to start with a question, perhaps a boring one, but I asked it yesterday and I thought perhaps now that it's approved, you would have a different answer. Do you have news on the deadlines with regard to the deliveries that coming into the country, the quantity, the dates? And do we know where the vaccines will come from? Yesterday, you didn't yet know which country this would come from. All questions with regard to logistics, availability, and supply will be discussed in a briefing that will follow this briefing. The technical briefing that we're doing now is to explain the technical aspects and the decisions made by Health Canada to approve the Janssen vaccine. And as I said, the logistics issue and other aspects will be explained in greater detail following in the next press conference. Follow-up?
D'accord.
Okay. With regard to the vaccine, then, we see that when it comes to AstraZeneca and the clinical trials talked about an efficiency rate of 62%, but what we see is that it's in fact even higher on the ground. Is there a reason to think that we could have the same results with this? That would reassure Canadians. In other words, that the efficacy rate could be higher, or are you not going to venture that far? The efficacy rate is the overall rate based on the information from clinical trials submitted by Janssen to Health Canada for the approval of the vaccine. Obviously, there is data when we look at the sub-geographic regions. For example, in the U.S., there is a slightly higher efficacy rate, about 72%. And the profile of the variants appear to be the same as in Canada. Based on the data that we have, this is the efficacy rate that we are putting forward at present. It is possible that there will be data, as we saw with AstraZeneca, in the use in the real world that will provide greater information about the efficacy of those getting vaccinated with that vaccine. But based on the information that we have to date, the efficacy rate is the one being put forward by Health Canada. But I'd like to come back to a little bit about the fact that people try to compare the vaccines and look at the efficacy rates, but we have to consider these in perspective. All the vaccines are effective. all vaccines will help Canadians to fight the pandemic. And the efficacy rates may vary depending on the design and studies, but we feel that overall these are very good vaccine choices, as demonstrated by the studies in the real world that support it, be it in Israel for the Pfizer vaccine or in Scotland for the AstraZeneca vaccine or in the UK. The data in the real world shows that these are exceptionally effective vaccines, safe vaccines to fight the COVID-19 pandemic.
Dr. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, Ivan Semenak, The Globe and Mail. Your line is open. À vous la parole.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. I guess this question is for Dr. Sharma. When the first two vaccines were authorized in December, they were very remarkably similar in their characteristics. The adenovirus vaccines are not quite as similar. For example, the AstraZeneca uses a different virus than the J&J vaccine. The dose, obviously, there's a dose difference. I'm wondering what differences were significant for the regulators in this approval, and in particular, is there any greater or less confidence about the J&J vaccine with the older age group, with 65 and over? Because of course we know that the advisory committee did not recommend the AstraZeneca vaccine for 65 and over. So I'm curious what difference or confidence you have on this one. And I have one follow-up.
Okay, you snuck in a double barrel question and then get a follow-up. Okay, so with respect to the vaccine, so vaccines are biologic products. They are very complicated. And so even if they're using the same platform, so, we were talking about the mRNA vaccines, those mRNA vaccines were very different for us as regulators. So they were using different mRNA, they were using different lipoparticles that go outside the mRNA, they were using different manufacturing processes. So those were two very different vaccines in our eyes. It's the same way as the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Janssen vaccine from a regulatory perspective are two very different vaccines. The manufacturing processes are different, the clinical trials are set up in different ways. So we really look at them as individual vaccines to see if they meet the standards of safety, efficacy, and quality, to make sure that where they're manufactured is, they're compliant and they're up to code, and as well that we have to make sure that the benefits of those outweigh the risks. So for us, they're all separate vaccines. The one exception to that, of course, was the Serum Institute of India version of AstraZeneca. That was a very close vaccine. Those were almost exactly the same vaccines, but manufactured in different places. With respect to the use of the vaccines in older age groups, so for the Janssen vaccines, we had a really large study, so over 40,000 people, conducted in different countries, and it was the same study, so it was done exactly the same way. When we looked at the numbers of people over 65 and over, that was 20% of the people in those trials, and the results from those groups showed that the efficacy, so how well the vaccine worked, and the safety profile was actually very similar in that 65 and older group and in younger groups. With AstraZeneca, it's not that we had evidence to say that we didn't think it would work in those age groups. We just didn't have that data. So we did put a notification, a notice in the chronic monograph that said the data was limited. And as we've talked about before, we're relying more on the real world evidence of the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine in people 65 and over.
Thank you. Follow-up?
Very briefly, with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they're also doing a 2-dose trial. I'm just wondering how you'll take that data on board and what you'll have to go through if, how will you manage it if it turns out that the vaccine is more efficacious with a 2-dose regimen?
Right, so there is a trial with the Janssen vaccine that's using a 2-dose regimen, 56 days apart, so 8 weeks apart. That started in November 2020 and is looking at recruiting about 30,000 individuals into that clinical trial in a number of international sites. So that will still be a number of months away to get results from that clinical trial. And we will look at that just as we would any information, whether it's coming from clinical trials or real world evidence, and incorporate that in terms of our assessment of the vaccine. Now, if it shows that, for example, that the efficacy is higher, the safety profile is better for whatever reason. If we were going to make a change to the utilization of that vaccine, then Janssen would submit that information to Health Canada. We would do a full review, and then if it met the standards, then we would change the recommendations in the product monograph for the vaccine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Up for our next question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, our next question, Raymond Filia, TVA.
Raymond Sevilla, TVA. Thank you. A question for Dr. Berthiaume. What springs to mind is that there's a single dose vaccine. I'd like to hear your opinion. How is this going to change the situation? Because now we're talking about a single dose to fight COVID-19. I think that the fact that it's a single dose allows ultimately a deployment of the vaccine that requires fewer resources in vaccine clinics. It provides protection for several months, and it's a single dose. So pressure on vaccine clinics with a single dose will drop. However, I must remind you that we are in a context where we're in a race against time to vaccinate as many people as possible. We have 5 vaccine options. We have 5 available vaccines. All these vaccines are very useful. This one is just a single dose, so it has an advantage in simplifying logistics. And like the AstraZeneca vaccine that doesn't require refrigeration, it offers some flexibility and increases the number of available options for the provinces in conducting their vaccine campaign. Follow-up question? Yes. What's the next vaccine that's under study for approval by Health Canada? Is it Novavax, and when will we have a decision on that? Is it a question of days, weeks, or months? Answer. You are right. The current only submission before Health Canada now is the Novavax vaccine, and the decision should come in the coming.
So the question was around the next vaccine, and we just, Dr. Berthiaume commented that the only other vaccine that we currently have under review is the Novavax vaccine. In terms of that file, there's still a fair amount of information that we're still expecting for that. So both on the manufacturing side and on the clinical data, we know that there's a large phase 3 clinical trial for Novavax that's ongoing that we don't expect to report out until potentially in April, the beginning of April. So we're still at least a few weeks, if not months away from a decision on Novavax.
Thank you. We'll now turn to the room. First question, Canadian Press.
Morning. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the review of the manufacturing process for Johnson & Johnson. We know that they said yesterday that they haven't figured out where their doses are coming from yet. So does that mean you have to review multiple different manufacturing sites, or is it sort of their process is the same as long as it's their site? I'm just wondering if you could walk through what you're looking for in that manufacturing review.
Sure. So this is actually, it's part of the review. So when we look at the sort of the data that comes in, it's in 3 big chunks. One is the preclinical data, that's lab animal studies. Then we have the clinical data, which is the human trials, the phase 1, 2s, and 3s. And then we have the manufacturing data, which is how the virus is actually made. On top of that, we have the facilities. And so it's where those vaccines will be made. And every authorization that we have for a vaccine also includes the naming of certain facilities. And that allows, if that's authorized, it allows the manufacturer then to, it basically says, this is the vaccine that we're giving you all this information on. This is where it's made. And so this is what's allowed to come into Canada. And that's the same for any vaccines. And if you have multiple sites on those authorizations, it allows you then to pivot, so supply in from different locations. And then if the companies want to add facilities to that license, they would have to come in with the data to show that those facilities have met what we call good manufacturing practices. So when we do the assessments of the sites themselves, we're really looking at a number of different things. So it's premises, products, processes, and people. Those are the things that we look at to make sure that that gets compliant, and then we make sure that that's matched up with the manufacturing information that's in the file. So for Janssen, sorry, it's a long-winded, but for Janssen, there were 2 sites that were listed with this authorization. One is in Europe and one is in the States. And then they can come back into Health Canada with additional data if they want to add sites to that authorization.
And when it comes to, I know you said in your opening remarks that any vaccine that you're offered is a good vaccine for you to get. But I'm wondering if there's anything in the reviews you've done of the authorizations that would indicate or help guide NACI, which I'm assuming is the next thing that will come in terms of how this vaccine will complement the ones we've approved. Is there anything in those, in your review or in your authorization, that would guide that Canadians should know about?
Yeah, I mean, NACI looks at, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization looks at similar information to what Health Canada looks at from a clinical perspective, except they're looking at it in the context of all the vaccines that are there. They also supplement that to a greater extent with real-world evidence and expert opinion. On the Health Canada side, we're more sort of focused a little bit more on the black and white of the study. So, you know, in general, this vaccine, the way they've looked at other vaccines, but just to the, you know, the point that you started with, that all of the vaccines are good vaccines. They all do. So, you know, if we think about it, the thing that has sort of threatened us the most about COVID-19 is its ability to kill, right? All of the vaccines, for all intents and purposes, squash that. So they're all good in that respect. As we said, what NACI does is sort of take that into context, look at whether or not there's certain priority groups that potentially would preferentially be given one versus the other. The other thing that they look at that we do not look at Health Canada is overall supply and supply limitations. So again, similar scientific base supplemented with other information and then taking into context the supply is what NACI will look at.
Thank you. Next question, CTV.
Hey, Dr. Sharma, I'm Mackenzie with CTV. I'm just wondering from your remarks about AstraZeneca before, you're saying that there's limited data with the 65-plus group, yet as the regulator, you've still approved it for 65-plus. I'm wondering why you made that decision, considering you've said that there's fairly limited information on that.
Right. So the wording in the product monograph for AstraZeneca is really specific, and I just want to make sure that we know how precise it was. It was that we have limited clinical trial data for people 65 years of age and older, and that's sort of that is our gold standard, but it really is the clinical trial data. What we had with AstraZeneca is something that we did not have with any of the other vaccines, is that we actually had a history of use with AstraZeneca, you know, thousands of doses that had been administered, and we had data from that real world evidence. We did not have that for Pfizer or Moderna, and we really don't have that for Janssen either. So it's the responsible thing to do when we're making the decision to include that in our assessment. But the challenge is that, as we said, we didn't have that clinical trial data, so there were still, you know, some gaps in terms of that. But supplementing it with the real world evidence in age groups that were older, even in people that were 80 years of age and older from the UK and from other data, was actually showing that the vaccine was quite effective. So that's why the indication was that you can use it for people 18 years of age and older. I mean, I think it kind of comes down to, so if I have a parent who is in that age group, and would I say if that person did not have access to another vaccine, do I think that AstraZeneca would be safe for them? Absolutely. Do I think that it would be effective for them? Yeah, probably. Now, if that same person had an option of a mRNA vaccine at this point in time, I would say we have more information for the mRNA. So I think the way that sometimes it's being reflected is do not use AstraZeneca in over age 65, when it's actually, hey, we've got these other two vaccines that are great, that have a lot of data in this age group. You may prefer to use these in that age group until we get more information.
Just to follow up on that, I'm going to sneak two in here. From what you've seen from the real world data that you mentioned, what are you seeing that would give any indication on how 65 plus would work for AstraZeneca? And I just want to go on Johnson & Johnson as well. You mentioned in your statement that it seems to show an acceptable level of protection against variants. How much will variants impact the efficacy of vaccines, not just with J&J, but with all the other vaccines that we've approved as well?
Sorry, what was the first part of your question? I was thinking variants.
Just about AstraZeneca and the real-world data we've seen from basically Europe.
Right. So the real-world data, I mean, the other part of the real-world data that we're looking at is on the interval. So it's the 65 and older, but it's also the interval. What we saw in the clinical trials and what seems to be borne out with the real-world evidence is that the closer you get to a longer interval, so towards 12 weeks, the better the efficacy is. And the challenge was that the numbers were still small in the clinical trials, but we're starting to see that more in the real world evidence, and it's creeping towards 80-85% efficacy in that higher end. Now, I'm putting a big caveat on that because it's real world evidence, but what we're seeing overall in people that are 65 years of age and older for AstraZeneca is that the efficacy that we're seeing in those older age groups seems to mirror what we're seeing in the younger age groups and might even be a bit higher. We're also seeing some evidence from AstraZeneca that the real world evidence for the younger age groups might be a bit higher than what we're seeing in the clinical trials. So I think it's evolving, but that's all positive in terms of the efficacy. We're not seeing anything that looks troubling in terms of lower efficacy. And when we talk about people in older age groups, it's not usually an issue around safety. It's whether or not, if you're older, if you're able to mount that immune response. So it really is on the efficacy side. And then with variants. So the experience with Janssen is that we saw regional variation. So that same clinical trial that was done in different places, we talked about a 66% efficacy in preventing COVID-19 disease overall. That was 72% in the United States. That was 68% in Brazil, and it was 64% in South Africa. And that 64%, when we looked at the South African studies, the vast majority of cases in South Africa were of the South African variant, the B1351. And so that was like 94.5% of those were there. So even with, a variant that we know is of concern, that we know potentially can impact the efficacy of the vaccines, we know that this still was good. It was still 64%. Now, overall with variants, we have to think about what that's going to mean overall. Viruses mutate. They are designed to try to stay alive and to replicate and not kill their host, but to continue to do that. And we usually see dominant strains, sort of a bit of the survival of the fittest. So we'll see how that's going to evolve. We published this week advice to manufacturers on how to design and what the requirements would be for studies to come into Health Canada for those variants. So, there are manufacturers that are looking at potentially redesign of their vaccines, potential booster. So, I don't know where we're going to be with respect to the vaccines and the variants in the future. I do know we're monitoring very closely. We're looking at which ones might actually change the efficacy of the vaccines. So far, the ones that we have are showing good efficacy against them. But if we need to make a change, then certainly, whether it's the mRNA or the adenovirus vaccines, they can be changed fairly quickly. And we are not asking for a full data package. We've got an abbreviated data package that we're asking for from the companies so that we can review that as efficiently as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Next question, CBC.
David Thurton, CBC News. Dr. Sharma, you mentioned that clinical trials are underway for teenagers. And we still don't have a vaccine yet for anyone under the age of 18. You could correct me if I'm wrong with that. So is it possible that Johnson & Johnson could be the first vaccine that's approved for youth? Is that something that we could see in the near future?
So just maybe one correction on that. So the Pfizer vaccine is actually 16 years of age and older. All the other ones are 18. So that one is a little bit at a younger group. All of the vaccine manufacturers are either looking at doing clinical trials in children or have already started. So the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines with respect to their clinical trials in younger age groups, and that's 12 to 15 for Pfizer, 12 to 17 for Moderna, have clinical trials that are ongoing that have actually finished recruiting patients into the clinical trial. So they're the ones that are the furthest advanced in that. AstraZeneca also has started a clinical trial for younger age groups as well. The one that I was referring to with Janssen was actually the first clinical trial that we have authorized in that younger age group in Canada that has Canadian sites. So all of these are looking for additional information in children. The Janssen study that has been authorized has not started recruiting patients yet. So that's going to still take a bit of time. Based on just timing, I'm expecting that we'll get more data from Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines first because their trials in children are most advanced, and then continue.
So is it possible that we could possibly see data arriving at Health Canada within the summer for this youth population, and maybe even possibly seeing a vaccine approved in time for, when school begins for the next academic year in the fall?
So in terms of the timeline, I think that timeline may be a bit optimistic. So the trials in children tend to be a bit slower to get up and running in terms of recruiting individuals. And then, of course, we have to conduct the trials and then take that information and assess that. It's not inconceivable that we might have some data in the summer, and potentially by the end of this calendar year, we might have some indications in children, but that's still pretty optimistic. The Janssen trial, for example, we wouldn't be expecting any results until 2022. So potentially by the end of the calendar year, we might have some answers for children, but it really will depend on how those clinical trials are conducted, and most importantly, the results that we get from them.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. We'll now turn over to the phone for another 15 minutes. Operator, next question.
Merci. Thank you. Our next question, Ryan Tumulty, National Post. Your line is open. À vous la parole.
Yeah, good morning. I think you might have said this off the top, but the line was a little, it broke up a little bit. Can you tell us the number of hospitalizations you saw in the vaccine group with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? I know you said it was much better at, it obviously had no deaths, but were there any hospitalizations or severe illnesses among people who got the vaccine?
28 after vaccination. If we look at all the numbers of people that were hospitalized after 28 days for vaccination, that was 0. So there weren't any there. There was one patient that was hospitalized early on in the study that did get the Janssen vaccine, but that was early and it was very close to the sort of 2-week mark. So the question is whether or not that offered any protection. But the important number would be at the end, where we think that there would be pretty close to full immunity conferred from the vaccine. There were 0 hospitalizations.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Ryan, follow up?
Yeah, just as a follow-up, vaccine hesitancy is going to be an issue going forward. I think one of the concerns that you hear from people who are hesitant about vaccine is that the approval was, subject to political pressure. I'm just wondering if you can outline the degree to which you keep the approval process, separate from the minister or politicians generally.
Right. I mean, the process is completely separate, right? These decisions are made based only on science and evidence, and it's grounded by the regulation, so it's grounded in law. Ultimately, it is the minister that put the interim order in effect, and it is her authority, but that authority, those decisions are all made by the scientists. And we know that it is so important for people to know that the scientific integrity of that review is sound. And as we said, we're making those decisions solely based on science and evidence with no influence at all. And just seeing the process from the inside, it is absolutely separate. And on the political side, and even in senior levels of government, they are taking every step to make sure that that is really clear. You can hear that in the way that people are speaking about it as well, because they know how important it is to know that, we're in this time where we're all facing this the pandemic, and a lot of information is coming at us. We're doing things in a more efficient way. We're doing it very quickly. At the same time, we're making sure that we're maintaining those high standards of evidence, and we're not cutting any corners. It's really important that people know that the integrity of that review process is sound. And having seen it from the inside, it absolutely 100% is.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, la prochaine question, Mike Lecouteur, Global News. Your line is open. À vous la parole.
Good morning. Thanks for taking our calls. I wanted to ask you, it may just be a very technical question, but which facility are we getting it from, the European one or the U.S. one, and when do you expect the first doses to be delivered to Canada?
Right. So in terms of the supply and the logistics, there will be another briefing after this sort of talking about that. I can say that with the advanced purchase agreements for Janssen, those included 10 million doses with an option to have another 28 million. The delivery of those were to be committed to arrive before the end of September. As with any vaccine, our colleagues in procurement are constantly trying to negotiate earlier doses. At this point in time, we don't know which site we'll be getting our vaccine supply from. It may be, right now they're authorized for both of those, so it could come from either of those sites. If they add other sites to the authorization, it could equally come from those as well.
Thank you. Follow up?
Yeah, and just as a follow-up, following up on Ryan's question and my question from yesterday on vaccine hesitancy, Detroit's mayor, Mike Duggan, has come out and actually said that he took a pass on some deliveries of Johnson & Johnson because he believes that Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines are actually better, and he wants to give his citizens the best. So now you have politicians who are making these decisions and, in a sense, laying it out there. How worried are you that this is not just something that's on the fringes, that this vaccine hesitancy is now a bigger thing that we'll have to deal with? And how will you, as Health Canada, try and help inform people better that that's not the way to go, potentially?
Right. So in terms of vaccine confidence, I mean, that's a key part of it, right? The best vaccine in the world, the most efficacious vaccine in the world will only work if somebody agrees to take it. And that agreement, that consent, is based on an understanding of what the benefits are and what the potential risks are. So we know so far we've been in a place where that we've had some scarcity of vaccines. So it's been the opposite. We've had people very eager to get the vaccines. We know that there are people that still have questions. I think it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of making sure that people have confidence in vaccines. What we're doing today is one step. So every time we have an authorization, being available to answer questions, putting all the information about that authorization on, we publish it, we put that on the web. And just this week, we were the first regulator, along with the European Medicines Agency, to actually publish all of the raw clinical data for the Moderna vaccine. And we will be proceeding to publish the data for others. So one is just, as the regulator and as the federal government, being really open and transparent and put out all of that information. We know that's one part of people's decisions around whether or not they will get that vaccine, whether or not they trust that the approval was based on good science. The other part of it is really variable. We're not all the same people. We don't have the same approach to risks. So when we talk about vaccines, we need to have a variety of tools and a variety of messages out there that people can draw from to be able to ask questions that they need. And it's good to have a healthy level of skepticism about things. It's good to have information and be empowered to have that information. Sorry. But what we found is that we need to have a lot of different information, and we need to equip other people to be able to amplify that message. I'm here at the federal government. People may not know who I am. They will take my information in a certain way. We also know that people in general respond to peers. And so other people that you know, other people that you trust, your healthcare practitioners. And when it comes to vaccine confidence, we need to put out as much information so that people who are looking at taking the vaccine will have the same confidence that we have in the vaccine. I would not hesitate to roll up my sleeve and get any of the vaccines that we have authorized by Health Canada.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Mike, follow up?
That was my follow-up, but I'll take a third.
Oh, I'm sorry. One question, one follow-up. We'll move over to the next question. Sorry about that. I got distracted by Sabria's phone.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, Alex Ballingall, Toronto Star. Your line is open. À vous la parole.
Hi, thanks very much. Just wondering, based on what you know about this new vaccine, we've got the option for 28 million more doses. Would you think that would be a good buy for the government, given that this is one dose, single shot vaccine? Would you think that we would want to get the 28 million options?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on that decision. That's really something that's done by procurement. I mean, I think we need to secure as many doses as we need to get everyone at least their first shot as quickly as possible, and then follow up with, the second doses, depending on where we are with respect to the pandemic and variants and all of that. So I would think that we'd have to look at the suite of vaccines that we have and the orders and do the calculations about how we meet that demand.
Thank you. Follow up?
Yeah, and just as a follow-up, we're talking about getting as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. I'm not sure if you guys have said this before, but do you have like a herd immunity target in mind that you think, that this would be the threshold for herd immunity amongst the Canadian population in terms of getting a shot?
Right. Well, so herd immunity is basically it's the level of immunization or protection you need in a group to even protect the people that do not have that protection. And you can get that immunity whether it's from having had the disease and having an immune response, or more commonly from vaccination. So it really is, the concept is really of the herd, of the pack, and the people that have the immunity protecting the people that are potentially weaker and don't. If you look at all viruses, herd immunity can be really anywhere from 50% to 90%. And it's a characteristic of how contagious the virus is. So the reason that people don't have a specific number for COVID-19 is because we're seeing changes in the virus, the SARS-CoV-2, in the transmissibility and how contagious it is. In general, for this type of virus, we look at around a 70% coverage. But there's been some speculation about whether or not it might even need to be higher than that, 80-85%, if we really have circulating variants that are very, very transmissible. So, I mean, it's in that range, but, there really isn't one magic number for herd immunity, as we said, because it really is a factor of the virus itself and its own characteristics.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. We're getting really close to 11 o'clock. I think we have time to our one very last question on the phone. Operator?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Merci. Question. Tonda McCharles, Toronto Star. Your line is open. À vous la parole.
Good morning. Thanks very much. Dr. Sharma, I'd like to understand from you, Alan Bernstein testified at a health committee within the last couple of weeks and said that there may be medical benefit in mixing and matching vaccines, that an mRNA vaccine and a viral vector vaccine could have advantages, especially, for example, if you use the viral vector first and then you come in with the mRNA. He said you'd be combining the best of both worlds, that they activate different parts of the immune system. I'd like you to talk about that and whether or not you see any advantage in what he recommended also in Canada doing a clinical trial here in combination with the UK.
Right. So what Dr. Bernstein was referring to is what we call a mixed schedule. So we have one dose of one type of vaccine and another dose of another type of vaccine. The ones that we commonly are sort of thinking about, at least for COVID-19, is either an mRNA vaccine first, followed by a viral vector, or the reverse. So viral vector first, and then mRNA second. And there's some lab studies that actually show that you might get exactly what he's talking about, an increased and a more sort of a plurality, like a more diverse immune response, and something that's actually higher overall. So that's from lab studies. And then we need to take that information and then get clinical studies. So we know that there's a study that's ongoing in the United Kingdom looking at these types of mixed schedules. They were looking at recruiting about 800 individuals there. I think that's still ongoing. So we absolutely will be looking to that for some additional data. I know NACI will obviously look at those as well and to inform their decisions. It would be, if there was a clinical trial that was proposed here in Canada to look at that type of mixed schedule, we would certainly welcome that. Depending on what the design of that would be, they would come into Health Canada for a request for a clinical trial authorization, and we would look at that study and the design and the outcomes that they are trying to look for and authorize that if that was appropriate. So again, some promising data, some clinical trials underway, and more data is always good to help inform those decisions.
Thank you.
Well, sorry, could I have a quick follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Eric? Thanks. So I understand you then to say Health Canada isn't per se recommending this at this stage, but I just quickly want to ask you to speak to the vaccine confidence hesitancy question in this regard. The chief scientist advisor to the government, Mona Nemer, this week said that what BC is doing and the stretching out of doses beyond the initial monograph is a population level experiment. Is she right? Are you all experimenting? Could you address her remarks? How does that contribute to vaccine confidence? Thank you.
Right. So maybe I'll start with the reference that Dr. Nemer made. I think, when I look at the recommendations that NACI made, it really was grounded in an evidence base. So again, the information that we look at Health Canada, plus the real world evidence, plus their expertise and their expert opinion, and then also looking at the supply situation. And that recommendation was extending or delaying that second dose up to 4 months. Based on the evidence that we've seen, I think that's a reasonable recommendation from NACI because it's grounded in science and evidence. I wouldn't classify that as an experiment, but really in the true sense of the word, an experiment is something that where you have a hypothesis, you have a question that you need to answer, and then you look at data, you set it up so that you look at the data, and then you see what the answer to that question is. So in the pure sense of the word, I think it could be characterized as an experimentation or as an experiment from a science perspective, but I know that that carries a lot of different meanings for people, and I do worry that that could be perceived in a negative way with respect to vaccine hesitancy and vaccine confidence. So what I would say is that NACI has made the recommendation. I think it's a reasonable recommendation. If we can get earlier doses, we do not have to wait for 4 months to give those second doses. If the supply opens up, I would suggest that that would be a really good thing to do. But I think it's really important. The words matter and how we say things matter, and we want to make sure that people have confidence that the decisions that are being made and the recommendations that are being made are sound. With respect to the mixed schedules, the Health Canada authorization is really for a vaccine. So that would be, this vaccine is authorized for use in this circumstance. So if a company would come in with evidence to show that you could use a mixed schedule, we would look at that and then potentially change the monograph and update what the vaccine would be authorized for. Usually in circumstances where we have mixed schedules, we don't have that. Companies don't necessarily come in with that data to do that. And so the recommendations of a body like NACI or of the scientific community in general is what people usually go by as recommendations for those schedules.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. That'll be all for today's technical briefing. Please note that the next COVID update is at 11:30 today. C'est ce qui met fin au briefage technique pour aujourd'hui. Veuillez noter que la prochaine mise à jour COVID-19.
The next COVID-19 briefing will take place at 11:30. Thank you.